Hello my dear students, I am Puranjay Biswas, Professor and Chairman, Department of English, Dhaka College, affiliated with the University of Dhaka. I welcome you to my today's lecture on Sir Philip Sidney, his text, An Apology for Poetry. Before going to the text of Sir Philip Sidney, I want to talk about the beginning of literary criticism, and then I want to come back to the 16th century. In fact, when we want to talk about literary criticism, we have to go back to the old classical age. At first, the name that I want to mention is Plato. Plato is called the first literary critic, though he had his position against poetry and poets. In his Republic, his masterpiece, Plato comments that poets have no role in the building of ideal state, so let them go. That is, Plato suggests banishing the poets from the commonwealth. But his disciple or student, Aristotle, took the favor of poetry. He stood for poetry. In his Poetics, he wants to say that poetry doesn't tell a lie. Rather, poetry deals with universal truths, and poets are not liars. The poets have significant role in our society, in our country, in the world. That is, Aristotle wrote the Poetics in defense of poetry. In fact, the Poetics is called the first most scientific literary criticism written in defense of poetry, and it was a reply to Plato's criticism mentioned in the Republic. But now come to the 16th century. The 16th century is called the Renaissance period in England. It is also called the Elizabethan age, and it is the golden age in the history of English literature. And Sidney is one of the great literary figures of this Renaissance period in England. We know that in different genres of literature, we find great revolution during the 16th century. We find a lot of great literary figures in different sections of literary composition. If we talk about sonnet, sonnet was introduced by Sir Thomas Wyatt and Earl of Surrey. They were pre-Shakespearean or pre-Elizabethan poets. If we think of Elizabethan poetry, the name that comes to us first is Edmund Spenser, who is called the poet's poet, or the most important poet of this age. His famous writing, The Fairy Queen, is regarded as one of the most important literary achievements of the 16th century. Again, if we talk about drama of the Elizabethan period as well as pre-Elizabethan period, the first dramatist is William Shakespeare. He is called the greatest dramatist in all languages. He was not only a dramatist but also a great senator and poet. And before Shakespeare, we can mention the university wits, particularly Christopher Marlowe, who was a great Renaissance playwright. If we talk about prose, I want to mention the name of Francis Bacon, who is called the father of modern English prose. So in all branches of literature, we find the great development and achievement. And this is why the Elizabethan age is called the golden age in English literature. My dear students and viewers, in the Elizabethan age, the Renaissance reached the pinnacle, and Sir Philip Sidney is called one of the greatest Renaissance men of this period. Sir Philip Sidney was the first English critic, and an apology for poetry is regarded as the first English literary criticism. In fact, Sir Philip Sidney was a great poet, critic, courtier, diplomat, politician, and MP. He also was a great soldier who met martyrdom in a battle in a foreign country. He sacrificed his life for the greater interest of the nation. He was knighted, that is, he was given the honorable title knight. Thus we can say that Sir Philip Sidney made a great achievement in English literature. I want to mention that this great literary personality had some major writings. Particularly, I can mention Astrophel and Stella. It contains about 108 sonnets. In fact, Astrophel and Stella is a collection of sonnets written about his mistress, Lady Penelope Bridge. Then another important literary achievement is the Arcadia. Arcadia is called a pastoral romance, and an apology for poetry. It has another title, that is the defense of poesy. Sir Philip Sidney wrote this literary criticism in defense of poetry. As Aristotle wrote the Poetics in defense of poetry to reply his master Plato's criticism. In the same way, Sir Philip Sidney wrote an apology for poetry in 1580 in reply to Stephen Gosson's nasty book, The School of Abuse. The School of Abuse, written by Stephen Gosson, is considered an attack or bitter criticism against poetry. In his book, Stephen Gosson wants to say that poetry is the mother of lies and poets are great liars. He also brings the charge that poetry is the nurse of abuse. He also suggests that we should not spend our time for poetry. In fact, Stephen Gosson follows Plato and stands against poetry. Stephen Gosson dedicated his book, The School of Abuse, to Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was surprised after reading the book, The School of Abuse, and he wrote an apology for poetry in reply of Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse. My dear students, Sir Philip Sidney stands for poetry. He speaks highly of poetry. In his book, he has given logical and intellectual explanation for poetry. In the beginning of his text, he reflects the significance of poetry and the acceptance of poetry in the past, particularly in Greece and Rome. The poets were highly estimated and they were regarded as diviner, seer, prophet, even maker. Sidney also says that even the uncivilized nations had their poetry. Both civilized and uncivilized races had their poetry. And poetry is the first light giver. It is the most antique and fatherly art. And poetry came first. So poetry is called the mother of all arts and sciences. So in this way, Sydney highly appreciates poetry and holds up poetry above all branches of knowledge and learnings. My dear students and viewers, Sir Philip Sidney, in Apology for Poetry, defines poetry. He explains the role and function of poetry. He also focuses on the classification of different types of poetry. Not only that, he speaks of the superiority of poetry to all other branches of knowledge and learning, particularly to philosophy and history. Sidney finds some faults and weakness in philosophy as well as in history, but he says that poetry is the best of all. It is superior to either philosophy or history, and like an advocate, he shows logical and rational explanations for poetry. If we discuss the text, we find the echo of the concept of Aristotle. I want to say that Sir Philip Sidney is the brainchild of Aristotle in respect of literary criticism. My dear students and viewers, I want to discuss the text in my next class. Thank you all for my class. I invite you to enjoy my class. See you next. All the best.